My name is Claudia Brittenham. I teach pre-Columbian art here in the art history department at the University of Chicago. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is a question that I've been thinking about a great deal as I teach a seminar on the art and architecture of Chichen Itza this quarter. And it's this. If I had to describe what makes Chichen Itza so interesting, I'd make two statements which at first might seem to be in conflict. And it's precisely that potential for conflict that I want to think about today. So, the first thing that I would say about Chichen Itza is that Chichen Itza is interesting because it's a place where things are new, where there are new forms of ritual, new forms of political representation, and because I'm an art historian and I'm particularly interested in the material record, it's a place where there are new artistic forms, new architectural forms, all of which have precedence within Mesoamerican tradition. Nothing ever is made out of nothing, but which seem shockingly innovative in terms of that Mesoamerican tradition. So the first thing I'd say about Chichen Itza is that Chichen Itza is a place where new things happen. Now, the second thing I'd say about Chichen Itza is that Chichen Itza is a place where the same thing happens over and over again. So, if you've made something radically innovative like the Castillo Pyramid, which so many of you will recognize from having been at Chichen Itza, why not do it again in something like the Osario in the southern part of the site? And then if you look, for example, inside the pyramid, the Castillo at Chichen Itza, you'll see that there's another pyramid quite like it, buried inside. And this repetition of forms extends not just to architecture, but to sculpture as well. There seems to be a general sentiment at Chichen Itza that anything that's worth doing once is worth doing 15 or 16 times. And in fact, that very aesthetic of repetition seems to animate some of the most innovative architectural forms at Chichen Itza, particularly things like the colonnade. Once again, there are Mesoamerican precedents for the colonnade, but it gets displayed and deployed again and again at Chichen Itza in a radically new way, and that very repetition is part of its power. So what to make of these two statements? Chichen Itza is a place where new things happen, and Chichen Itza is a place where the same thing happens over and over again. There seems to be some contradiction here. And yet, the more and more I think about it, I think that part of that contradiction actually has to do with the ways that we think about innovation and repetition and some of the myths that we tell ourselves about both of these processes. Now, if I were to caricature what we say about innovation, right? Innovation is new, innovation is exciting, innovation is radical. It happens all of a sudden, a bolt comes down from the blue, inspiration strikes. Repetition is dull and boring. It doesn't take a lot of imagination. There's nothing creative about copying something that's already happened. But of course, both of these positions are caricatures, right? We know that inventions rarely happen out of the blue, and that in fact a process of discovery, a process of experimentation, involves a heck of a lot of repetition. In order to make a breakthrough, be it scientific or artistic, sometimes you have to do the same thing over and over and over again with very slight modifications in order to achieve interesting and innovative results. That in fact repetition is, by its very nature, a part of the innovation process. At the same time, one of the things that I'll argue at Chichen Itza is that the repetition itself can be innovative. That this very new way in which the same forms are deployed over and over again is part of the overall aesthetic impact of the site, one of the things that makes its architecture and its urban experience so very new in Mesoamerica. Now, in order to make these claims, I'm going to look carefully at that process of innovation and repetition in a couple of different buildings at Chichen. We'll start by looking closely at the Coracle, this round building in the southern part of the site, and then look at the process by which the Temple of the Warriors is constructed and then reconstructed on the Great Plaza. I'll talk just a little bit about the Castillo and then end by talking about the colonnade and the colonnade as a new kind of form of repetition at Chichen Itza. But before we do that, let me make sure that we're all on the same page, geographically speaking, right? So we're talking about the site of Chichen Itza right here in the northern part of the Yucatan Peninsula, a site which flourished, the dates are controversial, but let's say between about 800 and 1150 AD. Now, this is a period that's after the collapse of the great lowland Maya cities, places like Tikal and Palenque and Piedras Negras. That classic order of the Maya lowland city-states was over by the time of Chichen Itza. And very many of the things that are happening in Chichen are a kind of response to whatever led to the failure of these city-states down here. At the same time, though, Chichen Itza is an international place. It's a place where we see evidence of ties all over the Mesoamerican world and even beyond it. There are new kinds of materials that show up for not the first time, but with increasing numbers at Chichen Itza. Things like gold, something that Mesoamericans hadn't been previously interested in before. Much of it coming from further down in in Central America, places like Costa Rica and Panama. Things like turquoise coming from the American Southwest and appearing in quantity at Chichen for the first time. And we see ties between Chichen Itza and other parts of the Mesoamerican world as well, both citations of the great old city of Teotihuacan, now abandoned but still a touchstone for civilization throughout Mesoamerica, as well as more contemporary relationships with sites like Oaxaca, El Tajín, and particularly Tula in the modern state of Hidalgo, something I'll touch on again at the end of this talk. Now, the site name, that, as far as we know, Chichen Itza, means something like at the mouth of the well of the Itzas. Chi is mouth, Chen is well, and Itza is a word that we don't quite know what it means. It seems to refer to a group of people, whether those are people who are related by profession, being something like sages or wise people, whether it's an ethnonym for a particular ethnic group, whether it's some other way of affiliating people, we don't really know. And we don't know either that this is what the site was called at the time that it was occupied. It's what it was called in the 16th century. And at that moment, it seems like that well of the Itza we might be able to identify with this very unusually deep and round cenote located just to the north of the site, which we know was a focus of great ritual activity during the period of Chichen's apogee and beyond. We find all sorts of things thrown into the cenote, from jades from the classic Maya cities far to the south, to new things like gold discs and my personal favorite Chichen Itza accessories, the goggles and the mouth mask. If I had to pick one thing I could wear from the site, that would totally be it. All of these things found in dredging of the cenote that happened both in 1904 with Edward H. Thompson and then again in the 1960s in a Mexican expedition led by Roman Piñachan, which turned up all sorts of fascinating things like textiles, a kind of material that we almost never see from the Maya region just because it's too hot and humid for them to survive. So we know, and we have these kinds of evidence for there being new forms of ritual at Chichen Itza. But because I'm an art historian and my bias is towards things, we're going to look at buildings and start down here in the southern part of the site at the Coracle. Now, the Coracle, as many of you will remember, is unusual in Mesoamerica in being a round building. And that is one of the things that makes it so very innovative. Now, as I've already said, nothing new ever comes out of nowhere, right? And so it's not that there hadn't been round buildings in Mesoamerica before. In fact, we can go back to something like one of Mesoamerica's first monumental constructions, this round pyramid at Kwik, which dates to the late formative period, 300 BC to 100 AD or something like that. And I don't mean to say that the people of Chichen Itza knew about some of these earlier round forms. They, in fact, I can tell you for sure, did not know about the pyramid of Kwik because it was buried under lava in a volcanic eruption sometime in the 1st century BC or AD. But there were round buildings. There are a fair number of round platforms in the Maya area. I'm showing you one of them at Ceibal. And in fact, one of the most common round forms of architecture would be something like just a platform that might have a perishable superstructure on top of it, or it might just be a platform. In fact, there is one of those that very kind of round platform at Chichen Itza, which you can see here in the initial series group, and it's really sweet. It thinks it's a turtle. Can everybody see that? It's got the face and the legs. It's an incredibly charming take on what you can do with a round platform. Now, if you weren't satisfied with the round platform as an architectural form, the other thing that would sometimes happen at Chichen Itza and beyond, another very common form of a round building would be a round platform that had a round superstructure on it. Something like a simple single room, which I'm showing you here at Uxmal, or perhaps a room with some more dividing doors in it, which we see in the Casa Redonda from Chichen Itza. And this would create a round space in its interior, perhaps not so different from some of the rounded shapes common in Mesoamerican vernacular architecture. But none of that really prepares you for what happened at the Coracle, right? Where we have not just a round structure, but a round structure that creates curving spaces inside. Let's see what happens when I press the slide. Right, so you can see, looking at it, that we've got a round building on a square platform. This is actually kind of weird in Mesoamerica. And then if you look at the plan, you can see that there are two concentric rings of vaulted chambers surrounding a solid round core in this building. And so I can tell you that as you walked into these spaces with these curving walls, you were inside a kind of space that no one had ever experienced before in Mesoamerica. And as you kept on walking inside, this building forced a kind of movement on you. You can see that the doors in from the outside and the doors into the inner vaulted chamber are rotated with respect to each other, so that you can't just walk straight through this building. You need to begin to rotate to get into that inner chamber. As I was telling my class yesterday, this is really a radical kind of space. And we, as people who have experienced such a range of different kinds of architecture in our lives, are kind of jaded to how extraordinary it would have been to have stepped into a space like this, given the range and the different kinds of spaces which Mesoamericans might have been used to living with. They would have been familiar with their own homes, which might in some cases have been very simple wattle and daub structures. They would have been familiar with raised platforms, with square buildings with vaulted chambers inside. But this kind of rounded vaulted chamber was really something new. The building gets even more radical. As you walk inside, you've walked beginning to spiral around into the central chamber, where you reach this large central pillar at the very heart of the building. And then things get even stranger. There is a hole in the middle of that column through which you can ascend a spiral staircase up to the second story of the building. Now, how you get into that hole in the column to ascend the spiral staircase to the second story of the building is a little bit mysterious. You can't get there from here as the building is now configured, but I think we imagine something like a ladder that's brought in on special occasions, so that access to this second story is really radically restricted. And then you continue that same counterclockwise spiraling movement, moving up the stairway until you reach this very small room on the second story of the building, which, as you can begin to see here, has a number of very unusual little windows in it. And here you can see a view of what they look like from the outside. You can also see that a fair amount of the second story is missing. Unfortunately, it's the part of the second story that we might have been most interested in. And so there are some limits to the kinds of conclusions we can draw about the Coracle because of its state of preservation. And I have to say that there's something about just the very shape of this building, even in its fragmentary form, with that cylindrical form, that looks kind of like a modern observatory, right? And I think that it's not the only reason, but it's certainly one of the reasons that people have always been so interested in exactly what you could see out of those windows. And so here's the thing. If you look straight out of any of the windows on the second floor of the Coracle, be them either these fairly wide windows, you can actually crawl out through one of these and stick your head out, or these much more narrow windows that if you look at them, they look like they're much wider spaces, but then they actually narrow down to a very small channel inside. And once again, like, there's nothing like any of this anywhere in Mesoamerica. I hope you're getting a sense of just how new and exciting this building is. Okay, but if you look straight through any of these windows, you don't see anything interesting on the horizon. You don't see any interesting astronomical phenomena. However, if you look from the inner edge to the opposite outer edge of some of these windows, like from here to there are some interesting phenomena about the position of Venus that it might be possible to observe through these windows. And so there is the possibility that one of the things that happened would be that you'd go up to the second story of this building to see interesting things that happened in the sky. But there's so much more going on in this building that's fundamentally new, particularly that kind of round space, that kind of rotating motion that it forces upon the viewer. But here's the thing. This building was an experiment. And the Coracle in the form that we see it now was not only radically new, it wasn't the first thing that had been built on the site. And we see, in fact, in the development of the Coracle, a series of experiments which recapitulate just about every other kind of round building that had ever been developed in Mesoamerica. And so I'm going to take you through that really quickly. The first thing that was built on top of that massive square platform of the Coracle was a simple round platform. We've seen a lot of simple round platforms in Mesoamerica, right? This was maybe a little bit taller than most of them. It had this very sweet little decorative molding around it, but it was a kind of form that was rather familiar in Mesoamerica. And yet, it wasn't at all satisfactory to the builders at Chichen Itza. Before the plaster had even begun to dry on this round platform, they realized that it was lacking a certain je ne sais quoi and began to add another round platform around the edges of it so that there ends up being what's in effect a kind of round bench all the way around the building. And that round bench had sloping sides. And now we've got a round bench with sloping sides around a cylindrical core, and that starts to look like some very late round buildings in the state of in Tampico, for example. But there were still some technical difficulties. One of them related to access to this building. And so the next thing that the builders did, and once again, it's important to stress that these things happened very quickly. Each of these stages was furnished. It was finished. If you wanted to just build this, you would have had the rubble core go all the way through the bench, but that's not what they did. They finished this almost. Plaster wasn't quite dry yet, added on this next thing, and then the next thing they did is they added a tangent staircase to the front of the building, thereby recapitulating a kind of form that gets you a number of round buildings in Mesoamerica. I'm showing you here something that was, once again, definitely not an inspiration for the builders of the Coracle, around an Aztec period round pyramid at the site of Calixtlahuaca, which you can see has that very same form, right? It's got steps going around the side, just like version 2.0 of the Coracle, as well as the staircase with a little platform going up to the front. But that didn't satisfy the builders of the Coracle either. And so then they added on to that original staircase this slightly trapezoidal shaped platform. So what we see now at the Coracle, round building on a square platform, I'd already told you that was unusual in Mesoamerica, right? But what's even more unusual is the way that it got there, running through a lot of other solutions, rejecting them, iterating through different possibilities before finally settling on something more radical, perhaps, than what the original design had conceived. And it's on that basis of that platform that this round building with these two concentric vaults gets built. And so I hope I've shown you that we get a process of repetition with change, a process of experimentation in the process of building this very innovative building. People at the Coracle, building the Coracle, didn't suddenly have a bolt of inspiration and say, hey, I'm going to make this thing with these two concentric ring structures. That's not how it worked. They tried, they experimented with a lot of different round forms, and then only finally ended up with this thing that was so radically new. I want to give just one more piece of evidence that the Coracle really was an experiment. And quite possibly an experiment that the very builders didn't have a great deal of confidence in. So you see these wooden cross ties, right? And this is a totally traditional thing. Any Mesoamerican vault is going to have these cross ties to help distribute stress and keep those walls apart from each other. But the Coracle, in addition to all of its other unusual features, has the distinction of being the most buttressed building in the history of Mesoamerican architecture. I'm not totally convinced that the builders thought that it was going to stay up, but it did. And that's why we can still see as much of it as we can see today. And you can see that this was really, I hope, if you've been to Chichen Itza, you've seen this building and you've said, my goodness, what an unusual shape. And I hope you see now even more how unusual it is in Mesoamerican context. Chichen Itza was a place where new things happened. And those new things were influential throughout Mesoamerica, because the Coracle spawned a number of imitations. I'm showing you here a round building at the site of Mayapan, a building that we have the sense in many ways was built in the image of Chichen Itza. And if you're experiencing a feeling of déjà vu, good for you. There's absolutely no question that the round building at Mayapan was built in reference to the round building at Chichen. And in fact, you can see that this round building at Mayapan has 4 entrances oriented more or less to the 4 cardinal directions, just like the Coracle at Chichen Itza. They didn't do the double vault, but there is a single solid core at the inside of structure Q152, which has 4 little niches inside it, as if echoing that much more complex structure of the Coracle. But I don't think the builders at Mayapan thought that they could get that building to stay up with the 2 concentric vaults. And this building originally probably looked even a little bit more like the Coracle when it had 2 stories, something that we know from 19th century engravings. Here's Frederick Catherwood, and here's Brasseur de Bourbourg. The building was struck by lightning sometime in the late 19th century, so we don't know much more about the top than these 2 reconstructions, which, as you can see, don't quite agree with each other in a rather frustrating way. But that resemblance to the Coracle was perhaps even stronger than in the building that we see here. And that's not it. In the late post-classic period on the Yucatan Peninsula, there's kind of a rash of round buildings. Here's one at Palmul, Nomul, and one at Tulum that some of you might have seen, but perhaps not really paid attention to. And you see, none of these buildings really look like the Coracle. None of these buildings look exactly like each other. But I'd suggest that that very idea of making a round building refers back to that original act of innovation at the Coracle, even if it's mediated maybe through Mayapan or through one of these other sites. So much for the Coracle. What we're going to do now is move our attention from this southern part of the central core of Chichen Itza up to the Great Plaza and talk a little bit about the same kinds of processes of innovation and repetition with a new twist. One of the things that's particularly interesting about some of the buildings on the Great Plaza, the Castillo and the Temple of the Warriors among them, is that if you happen to look inside them, there are other buildings, just like Russian dolls. Now, this is actually a fairly Mesoamerican thing to do. If you're going to build a big building, why start from scratch? Why not take an existing building that now looks a little bit small and sad and use it as the core of a slightly larger construction? This is one of the ways that the Pyramid of the Moon at Teotihuacan gets to be the massive hulking thing that it is. For example, as Saburo Sugiyama's excavations have shown, there's 6 different iterations that get us up to the size of the Pyramid of the Moon over the course of several centuries. we can see even more complicated processes of iteration at something like structure 10L26 at the site of Copan, where a series of excavations have revealed an almost 3-century series of buildings, right? Where we start with a very modest platform sometime in the 5th century and end up with a fabulously large pyramid with a hieroglyphic staircase detailing the entire dynastic history of Copan by the middle of the 8th century. But what I hope you can see, particularly here at Copan, where we have these very long strings of buildings, is that there's a real change in architectural form from one building to the next. We can see that perhaps even better at structure 16, where archaeologists once again have gone all the way back down to a very, very modest platform called nicknamed Hunal, that seems to have been the tomb of the dynastic founder of Copan sometime in the 4th century, that got enlarged and enlarged and enlarged and enlarged once again until there's a final structure built on top of it by one of Copan's last rulers. But as you look at this artist's reconstruction of what those superimposed buildings look like, I hope you get the sense that the decoration moves from absolutely the latest thing in the 4th century, in the 5th century, to absolutely the latest thing in the 6th century, to absolutely the latest of 7th century fashions. So that the iteration in place in most Mesoamerican sites consists of building bigger and better when resources allow, sometimes referring back to what's hidden underneath. That's absolutely something that structure 10L16 at Copan does. But also to updating the building in keeping with Mesoamerican fashion. And in that context, one of the things that's interesting about these iterations at Chichen Itza, there are two things that are pretty interesting about them. One is that the inner building and the outer building look relatively like one another. There are certainly some differences in between them, but they're not necessarily as radical as the shifts between one building and the building that encases it at other Mesoamerican sites. And the other is that the passage from one building to the next building seems often to have happened fairly rapidly at Chichen Itza. We've got the best evidence for that when looking at the succession of the Temple of the Chocmol right here and the Temple of the Warriors above it. And here's how we know. The Temple of the Chocmol on its outer walls has something like 15 coats of stucco, while the Temple of the Warriors has, and I really pity the person who counted them, 131 millimeter thin layers of stucco on it. And or Morris, the archaeologist who reports this, says, we might have missed a few layers in there. So, but what this suggests is that this building is periodically repainted. You give it a wash of stucco, there's painting on some of those layers of stucco. You've got to update your building, give it a fresh coat of paint every once in a while. And if the Temple of the Warriors was visible for 131 of those coats, they could be years, they could be 2 years, they could be slightly longer periods. The Temple of the Chocmol was visible for not nearly such a long time, for a period of time that might have been as short as 15 years, before it was replaced by a structure that looked pretty much like it, except a little bit bigger. So let me walk you through how that process worked. So the Temple of the Chocmol is buried inside the Temple of the Warriors, and so we are going to be looking at a lot of reconstructions. And this one we've seen already. What it's important to realize, so the Temple of the Chocmol had probably 3 layers of platforms or, gosh, what's the word for this, sort of architectural moldings on the outside of it. And inside had a plan with 2 rooms, square columns in each room, a bench running around the edges of the building, and a bench running around the edges of the inner room. Now, I should explain what we're looking at here, because, well, you might think, and in fact it's great Mesoamerican practice, as happened at the Castillo, to use the entire previous building as a way to bulk up the later building, the Russian doll style. That's not quite what happened at the Temple of the Warriors. At the Temple of the Warriors, instead, for reasons that are still a little mysterious, they decided to tear down part of the Temple of the Chocmol and the colonnade that was associated with it, move the whole thing a couple feet backwards and start all over again. So what I'm showing you here is a plan of the Temple of the Chakmul. What you see here with solid lines is what survives inside the body of the Temple of the Warriors. And what you see outside in dotted lines is what was projected to have existed in that original state. And there are impressions of some of the columns that the archaeologists were able to see to reconstruct this. What I'm showing you down here is the plan of the Temple of the Warriors right here, and the dashed lines show us where the Temple of the Chakmul underneath it would originally have been. Okay, everybody with me, more or less? Two buildings, they're not quite on top of each other, so we only have parts of the Temple of the Chakmul. But from what we have of the Temple of the Chakmul, we can see that it was actually pretty similar to the Temple of the Warriors. Everybody see that? It's a two-room building with square columns inside, and then a bench running around the inner room, probably an Atlantean altar. Here, I'll show you pictures of all of these things in a minute. And then two serpent columns at the front doorway. So let me show you what that looks like in the Temple of the Chakmul. One of the things that's great about the Temple of the Chakmul is because it wasn't used for such a long time and because it was buried, the paint survives. So we can see that on one of these square pillars, I'm not actually sure which one it is, there are carved these standing figures, and the carved details would all have been painted to give us a sense of a person wearing a blue mask of a particular kind of deity, a skirt right here, and a really fabulous hat. Everybody see that? Good. Okay, we can also see carved pillars, check. Serpent columns would have been in the front room, right about here on that reconstruction if it had gone all the way out there. And once again, the paint survives on that feathered serpent from the Temple of the Chakmul in a way that we don't see on things that were left closer to the surface at Chichen Itza, but let us reconstruct just how colorful all of that painting would have been. And of course, the other main sculptural feature of these buildings is the Chakmul itself. This kind of sculpture of a recumbent figure holding something on his belly. In my survey classes, I tend to do artistic reconstructions of the poses of Maya sculpture, and this is always the worst one to do. I should say that the name Chakmul for these sculptures was given to them by Augustus Le Plongeon, a 19th century explorer who, when he arrived at Chichen Itza, thought that he had discovered where the people of Atlantis had gone. So Chakmul is a kind of made-up name that he gave these things. It means something like great jaguar claw. It has nothing to do with these sculptures whatsoever, but we've kept the name just because it's hard to think of anything else to call them, and it is a really distinctive sculptural form. So we've got one of these inside the Temple of the Chakmul. It was tipped over on its side and buried in rubble when this building was opened up. And there's another one, as you can see, at the Temple of the Warriors above it. So just to walk you quickly through the Temple of the Warriors, we can see that we've got all of the same features that we had in the Temple of the Chakmul, right? Serpent columns, check. Chakmul, right about here. Check. Square columns inside, check. And then if you look straight through the square columns into the inner room, Atlantean altar on the back wall. And let me show you that a little bit more closely. So it is a throne or an altar, a large raised surface that is supported by these figures holding up the altar with their arms. And in the case of these sculptures from the Temple of the Warriors, they look like they're being sort of driven into the ground by the weight of that stone, don't they? And in fact, these guys seem to have been reused from some other building, and they're actually set a little bit into the ground. So if they look like they've been cut off at the knees, it's because they have been cut off at the knees. And they're actually embedded into the plaster of the floor. Now, they didn't find an Atlantean altar in the Temple of the Chakmul, but they found the mark on the wall where something had to have been. And perhaps it was even these sculptures that were there. Hard to know for sure. Okay, so we see then that the Temple of the Warriors replicates many of the features of the Temple of the Chakmul even although it does it in a slightly bigger way, right? That we only had one row of square columns in each room at the Temple of the Warriors, now, or at the Temple of the Chakmul. Now we've got two at the Temple of the Warriors. The whole thing is bigger and better. And so here we have a process of iteration and repetition, where one of the goals of the iteration and the repetition is to do the same thing, only bigger. But just as at the Coracle, we can see that there's a kind of process of experimentation that happens as bigger and better is being built. And we can see that in a couple of late changes that the archaeologists led by Earl Morris in the Carnegie Project in the 1930s suggested that they, or in the excavations are in the 20s, report is in 1931, suggested that they saw in the Temple of the Warriors. The first of those is that the body of the Temple of the Warriors pyramid has 4 levels, right? So let's count them. 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? And so each level consisting of a sloping talud and then a flat tablero on top of it, Mesoamerican form going back to the site of Teotihuacan and beyond. Whereas if we look, and we're going to have to go flipping back to do it, at the original body of the Temple of the Chakmul, it only had 3 of those talud tablero layers around its side. So bigger, better, yes. But here's what's interesting. That top layer of the pyramid of the Temple of the Warriors seems to have been a late addition. So here we're looking at the back of the pyramid, and you can see here's the bottom layer, the second talud tablero layer, the third talud tablero layer, and you can see that each one of these has a carved frieze going all the way around on that figured talud. Now, when the archaeologists kept on excavating, they found enough finishing stones to get the building even taller, clear evidence that the building had been made even taller, but no evidence of that kind of sculpted frieze. As if maybe late in the process, somebody said, hey, wait, this building isn't tall enough. Let's make it taller, but didn't necessarily have time to finish the kind of elaborate sculpture that those earlier layers had had. And you can see, I think, even in the ways that the Temple of the Chakmul pillars were cut off, that sense that the original plan had been to make the building a little bit shorter than it ended up being. So what happened? If we look at the Temple of the Warriors, you see this kind of colonnade in front of the Temple of the Warriors, right? And we see these columns out in space, and we think that they're perfectly wonderful just the way that they are. But the fact is that they would have originally had a roof over them. And you can see the edges of that roof right here. Does everybody see the sort of triangular shape right here? That's the vault that would have originally covered, and there would have been 3 parallel vaults originally covering the colonnade. And so here in Tatiana Proskuryakov's reconstruction, you can see how that original plan would have gotten the height of the roof covering the colonnade right up to the top of that 3rd level of the Temple of the Warriors pyramid. And that was the original plan. And then at some point somebody said, ooh, no, totally not going to work. We've got to make this building taller. The other late change that happened in this building had to do with the staircase. If one looks at the Temple of the Chakmul, you can see that it had actually a very narrow and modest staircase, about the same space as 1 intercolumnar width between the columns of the colonnade. And as far as we can tell, the original plan for the Temple of the Warriors was that it was also going to have a staircase that was only 1 intercolumnation wide. And in fact, the sculptured bench at the end of the colonnade kept on being worked and carved as if it was going to end right here when that staircase was only 1 column wide. And then at some point, once again, after construction had begun at the Temple of the Warriors, somebody said, no. That staircase looks totally out of proportion. And so they expanded to this staircase that is 3 columns wide, which you can see now right here, which has that strange effect that there are columns in the middle of the staircase. Does everybody notice that? That's one of the really weird things about the Temple of the Warriors. And it's a late change in the building process that got us there. So this process of iteration and experimentation took a slightly different form at the Temple of the Warriors than it took at the Coracle. But we can see that even when you were building the same building over again, there were still places for experimentation, still places for change, still places where new discovery and refinement could take place. And that's exactly what we know about processes of discovery and invention anywhere in the world. But it doesn't stop there. Because if you happen to look right next to the Temple of the Warriors, just north of the Temple of the Warriors, you will see a building called the Temple of the Big Tables that looks just a bit like the Temple of the Warriors. So this is something we didn't see at the Coracle, right? The Coracle was one building. It got repeated at other sites in Mesoamerica, but never again at Chichen. Once they did it, they said, okay, fine, we did that. We don't need to do that again. But one of the things that's really striking about many architectural forms at Chichen Itza is the way that they get repeated not just in place, but across the entire landscape of the site, and sometimes right next to each other. So let's go to the Temple of the Big Tables. Serpent columns, check. Square pillars carved with figures, check. Atlantean altar, check. If you're having, and here's this. Identical structure buried inside, check. So here we are. Here's the Temple of the Big Tables up here. And Peter Schmidt, in excavations over the last 20 years, has found another building just like it underneath that once again has carved and painted columns that have preserved their color, just like the Temple of the Chalk Mule. If you think you're seeing double, you're not the only one. But it gets worse. The Temple of the Little Tables down here, just to the east, in the colonnades. If you are experiencing at this point a feeling of déjà vu, you are not wrong to do so. A lot of things get repeated at Chichen Itza. Now, I could make the same argument for the Castillo, right? We've got the building of the Castillo itself. We look inside the Castillo and see another pyramid, which is in many ways similar, in some other ways different. But I'm not going to talk too much more about this because Virginia Miller in the audience has just written a lovely article explaining some of the relationship between the inner and the outer Castillo. All I will say is that there's another building located a little bit to the south of the site called the High Priest's Grave, or the Osario, which duplicates some of and replicates some of the features of the Castillo on the central plaza. So we get, just as at the Temple of the Warriors, at the Castillo we get replication in place and replication across the landscape, with lessons learned, subtle changes between one iteration and the next. Those repetitions and iterations, it's really interesting to note, extend beyond the mere form of the architecture to the scenario and perhaps even the environment in which these buildings are built. So we have not just the Castillo, but also a couple of radial platforms next to the Castillo. We have not just the Osario, but a number of radial platforms next to the Osario. And here's a really interesting new discovery. Using remote sensing techniques, archaeologists associated with INA have just suggested that there's something like a cenote, or a giant cavern, underneath the Castillo. Hasn't been excavated yet. Stay tuned, everybody, for exciting new developments here. But we happen to know that there is also just such a thing underneath the Osario. So underneath the Osario, underneath the High Priest's grave in the southern part of the site. So repetition, replication, all over the place. I could make the same argument about the Mercado, another one of those innovative forms drawing on Mesoamerican tradition that we see at Chichen Itza. Because if it's worth building something once, why not do it again and again and again? And of course, this expands. This is not just about building plans, right? It's things like serpent columns. No two are identical. Each one might represent lessons learned from the previous one. We could make the same argument about chalk mules. There is just this aesthetic of repetition at Chichen Itza. And so now I want to turn to that idea of repetition as innovation, repetition as an aesthetic, and do that by talking about these colonnades, right? So I've warned you, and and I just can't resist using this photo. This is an aerial photo that was taken by Charles Lindbergh during, or really probably by Anne, since we assume he was flying the plane. I have to give my advisor, Mary Miller, credit for that suggestion. That was taken during those Carnegie Reconstruction projects in the 1920s. So you can see one colonnade was a great idea, right? And there was a colonnade associated with the Temple of the Chalk Mule. It got replaced with the colonnade associated with the Temple of the Warriors, so why not build a couple more of them, right? And so that these columnar spaces extend out in various different directions from the Temple of the Warriors. And this is one of the most affecting kinds of architectural space at Chichen Itza. But the way that we understand it is, of course, not at all the way that these spaces would have originally been, right? So the first thing I hope you already have a sense is that these stone columns would originally have been brightly painted in the way that we can see from looking at those well-preserved columns inside the Temple of the Big Tables and inside the Temple of the Chalk Mule. And the other thing, as I've mentioned already, is that these spaces would have been vaulted, right? And here on the edge of that Temple of the Warriors staircase, you can see how the walls, the columns would have supported a vault spring, right? And we'd have gotten one corbel vault, another corbel vault, and then a third corbel vault parallel. And here's a reconstruction by Tatiana Proskuryakov of what that would have looked like. And here is a much more modest kind of colonnade at in the initial series group in the southern part of the site that gives you a sense of what that vaulted space would have been like to experience. And so there's a power in the repetition of that form, right? In this form that's made up of that same thing over and over and over again. But there's also a powerful political statement that's made by that repetition, particularly on this colonnade in front of the Temple of the Warriors, where each of the sides of each of the columns is carved with a different figure. And no two of these figures are identical. And so there's a claim here that the roof of this colonnade, and perhaps by extension the city itself, is being sustained by its citizens, by citizens who come in all different kinds. And so while for a late classic Maya city, one of the preeminent forms of sculpture would have been the stela, which represented and stood in for the body of the king. At Chichen Itza, that representation of the body politic was a much broader representation of the body politic that included many more people. And in its very repetition, this sense of infinite repetition, right? If you can add how many more people to this, here we have the assembled multitudes of Chichen. And I should credit this argument to Cynthia Kristen Graham, who makes a similar argument about the site of Tula. But I think so many of the things that she says there are equally applicable to Chichen Itza. And we can see that same kind of argument being made with the Atlantean thrones, right? Does everybody get that? Whoever gets to sit up there is being held up by various different members of the community. And many people have said many people have said these things, but there's something about that repetition and the way that that helps make this claim. So repetition at Chichen Itza is something new. Now, there's an elephant in the room that some of you guys might have been aware of and others of you might not, which is the relationship between the site of Chichen Itza on the Yucatan Peninsula and the site of Tula to the north in Hidalgo. Because if everything that I've said about innovation and repetition is true at Chichen Itza, when you go to the site of Tula Hidalgo, you might also experience a feeling of deja vu. Now, if you look at something like Pyramid B at Tula, one of the reasons that it looks quite so much like the Temple of the Warriors at Chichen Itza is because when the people were reconstructing Pyramid B at Tula, they were looking at the Temple of the Warriors. But there are also very good reasons to think that this building did, in fact, have many characteristics that were very similar to those of Chichen, and that there was some kind of relationship between these two sites. Now, which came first, the Chichen or the egg? I can't help it, I'm so sorry. This is the most intractable problem in Mesoamerican studies. And it's not actually a question, I think, that we can answer with the present state of knowledge. Because just as there's this kind of aesthetic of replication at Chichen Itza, there's something very similar at Tula, except that at Tula it extends even further, that there's a first early city center called now Tula Chico that gets burned, covered, abandoned, and then the entire city gets rebuilt. And if there's a relationship chronologically between Tula and Chichen, it's probably between Tula and Tula Chico, which has really never been satisfactorily excavated. So we need probably more discoveries in order to answer that question. But as my students rebuked me when I asked this question in the Art of Mesoamerica several years ago, it's also the wrong question. And in order to explain why, I've been thinking a lot about scientific discovery in these weeks where all the Nobel Prizes are being announced. And you know, one of the critiques that people make about all of the big name prizes and the ways that they recognize a single person or just a few people for their work is that, of course, this isn't how scientific discovery takes place. Innovation, invention isn't just a bolt from the blue, as we've talked about, right? It takes a lot of diligent repetition with slight modification. But the other thing is that innovation never occurs in a vacuum, right? Every scientist is talking to other scientists. Every scientist is building on discoveries and techniques that have been developed by other scientists. And when somebody might make one breakthrough, they stand on the shoulders of many others with whom they were in constant communication. And so I think the same thing is also the answer to the Tula-Chichen conundrum, right? That these two cities, there's no reason to think that they weren't in constant communication with each other. And that ideas that developed at one got played with, bounced around, developed at the other, bounced back to the first, and back and forth and back and forth. And so to say which came first is possibly the least interesting question that you could answer, particularly because we can't answer it with the data that we have now. And to say instead, how did these two cities bounce ideas back and forth? What was this kind of collaborative or competitive environment taking place in Mesoamerica? How was the Mesoamerican world interconnected? That's perhaps a more interesting question to answer. And what we can say, I think, looking at both Pyramid B or something like the Palacio Quemado and all of the halls of the columns at Tula, at that iteration of sculptural forms like the Chacmul, which develop both at Tula and Chichen Itza, what we can say about all of these things is that at both Tula and Chichen Itza, during this period in Mesoamerican history, repetition was something new. Thank you. I think I have just a couple of minutes for questions, if anybody would like to ask any. Yes?
What is believed to be the actual time scale of the building of both the Coracle and the Temple of the Chacmul and then the Temple of the Warriors? Are we talking about 20 years, 100 years, 200 years?
Oh, how quickly each building is built. Probably each building is built within a decade or less. We tend to be really impressed by the amount of manual labor that goes into a pyramid, particularly because we would totally not do this by ourselves. But Elliot Abrams in particular has done a number of energetic studies where he says it actually doesn't take that many people that much time to build a pyramid. We think that it's this huge, huge investment of labor, but it's maybe a tenth of the able-bodied male population working for a couple of months, in addition to their agricultural duties for a couple of years, or something like that. So in terms of absolute chronology, both of those buildings are exceptionally hard to date. There are dates on the Coracle that place it in the 880s and 890s, but exactly how those dates relate to the building is a little bit harder to know. Temple of the Chacmul, we are even more at sea in terms of its chronology. The one piece of evidence we have, even though we don't know quite how to interpret it, are those 15 layers of stucco, suggesting that it wasn't exposed for such a long time, and that the Temple of the Warriors, once it was built, stayed visible for a much longer period. Yes?
So I'm going to try to fit two questions in and blow one off if you don't have time.
Sure.
I've always been impressed by the massing of Mayan architecture. Someone who lives in today's culture, architecture is about interior spaces.
Right.
This isn't the case with Mayan architecture.
Yes.
I'd always assumed that it was about building technology, but some of your remarks made me think perhaps it was a cultural bias to an external form with these shallow, abbreviated spaces internally. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that. And can you speak to this improvisational nature of building? Did they start with a plan, or was it all sort of figure it out as you go?
Okay, so interior versus exterior space, too. One of the most important things to think about interior versus exterior space is the weather. We live in a place where we really need a lot of interior spaces if we would like to stay alive. That's not true in the Yucatan. And our sense in a lot of Mesoamerica is that buildings might be places for sleeping, they might be places for storage, but a lot of day-to-day activities, why would you stay confined in a stuffy building to do them when it's perfectly warm outside? And so that a building is a space that provides a base then for other kinds of activities. You might do your weaving, you might do your cooking, you might do a lot of your working outside, maybe with a nice little awning or the shade of a tree. So the exterior space is relatively de-emphasized. These masses, there are obviously structural reasons for them. One of the ways to get a really big building to stay up is to make it absolutely solid inside, right? Pyramids show up all over the world for a reason. It has neither to do with aliens nor boats sailing across the sea. But it also has to do with the fact that most of what we're looking at when we see a Mesoamerican site are public buildings, or very, very elite buildings. And so for all that they have a functional purpose, I sometimes find myself wondering, on a particularly sweltery day inside one of these vaulted chambers in a Mesoamerican palace, I find myself longing for a thatch and daub house that a common person would have lived in. And so part of the thing that monumental architecture does is it makes public statements. And so that's another thing that the masses of these buildings are doing, besides serving whatever functional purpose, even if that functional purpose is just get the temple on top really high up. As far as the planning process in architecture, we don't know very much. We certainly know that the Mesoamericans had paper, they made books. There's no reason to think that there isn't some sort of planning that might have happened on paper before buildings were built, but none of that paper survives. And when we do look at structures, we see evidence over and over again for these kinds of improvisations with changes. So somebody has to be overseeing the work. You have to have some vision of what you're going to do before it starts to go up. But it's also undoubtedly a much more flexible process where there are late changes. I think there always are, though, right? I mean, having a perfectly designed blueprint doesn't mean that that doesn't happen. Okay, we are right at 10:30, so if anybody, but the next thing doesn't start until 11. So if anyone wants to stay around, I'm happy to talk for a little bit more.
Does anyone know what the chalk rules represent?
There are an infinite number of debates about what it is that the chalk mules represent. Do they represent the maize god? Do they represent sacrificed prisoners? Do they represent warriors? Virginia is making faces in the back. I don't think we know yet. What were they used for? I mean, that's what I want to know more first, and then that helps you understand it. So it's, there are many there are many things that we still need to think more seriously about. And right now, there are a number of competing theories advocated by people very dear to me, and I can't declare for any one of them. Okay, other questions? Yes.
Has any determination been made where they quarried the stone and how the method of transportation to bring those?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. And yes, there's a limestone quarry found about 3 miles north or 3 kilometers north of the site center at a place called Kumtun. And one of the really interesting things, Rafael Cobos has excavated a sakbe, or a road, that goes straight from the center out to that quarry. So one of the things they did to make transportation easier was they built a road. As far as getting things from point A to point B, people. No draft animals, no wheel in the Americas, right? But it's amazing what you can do with eager young men. And it's also, you might put logs under a particularly heavy stone to roll it from one place to another. But we know from when archaeologists, I think led by Mike Coe, were trying to get the colossal heads out of the Olmec site of La Venta, and they had, the tractors broke down and everything. And at some point, the workers said, "Okay, screw this," and they tied a number of ropes, put it on some logs, and carried the colossal heads out like that. So, people power is the short answer. Yes.
I saw some of these elements at Cozumel,
Mm-hmm.
and I was wondering, are they copied from Chichen Itza or vice versa? The recording.
Right. Yes. Most of what you're seeing at Cozumel is probably later than Chichen Itza, and so it is referring back to Chichen. Whether it's referring back directly to Chichen Itza or whether it's mediated through one of those other sites like Mayapan is something still to be investigated. Yes?
From the floor plans, it becomes obvious that while we were talking about square platforms, some of the platforms are trapezoid.
Yes.
Also, that this colonnade is not at 90 degrees.
Yes. Yes.
And these are people who could have obviously chosen to do it. Are there any explanations?
Well, this was something that came up in my seminar yesterday. And what we ended up concluding is that these are aesthetic choices. Because you are 100% right. If the Maya wanted to make a right angle, they could have made a right angle. But in fact, I find that gentle asymmetry to be one of the things that makes Chichen Itza so visually interesting, right? That if everything were at perfectly right angles, it might feel cold and mechanical. And in fact, the best place to look at this, if everyone will bear with me for just a second, is to go back up to the Coracle and really appreciate it on its platform for just a minute. Nothing in this building lines up with anything else, right? And you look at this and you say, incompetence? No, it can't be incompetence. They got those vaults to stand off after all. And in fact, what's kind of wonderful about this, as you can see, is the way that the building begins to rotate. Do you see that? The staircase is off center from the staircase, is off center from the staircase, is off center from the doors, off center from the mask. And so it's prefiguring what you do as you move through the building. Now, people tend to straighten that all out in reconstruction drawings, which I've always been convinced is one of the reasons that Eric Thompson hated this building. And he said, it looks like a bad wedding cake. And that's because that's what would have happened if it had been symmetrical. Yeah, Virginia.
A couple comments.
Yes.
I think the latest dating on Temple of Chapel and the Inner Castillo is about AD 900.
Right. Yeah.
The site was excavated before the invention of radiocarbon dating, so we're missing a lot of information.
Right.
And if we're excavating later, we'd have. And the other thing that you might have mentioned, because I came in a bit late, is that under the Castillo there might be a third
Yes.
pyramid that they're not sure. And that team that did the tomoscopy or something
Right.
called to look inside. Their next project is to do more of that kind of non-invasive work to see if there is yet another structure under there and to figure out the layers of the Castillo.
Right. Yeah. So there could be even more.
There might even be like a founding burial underneath there.
Wouldn't that be satisfying? I mean, it's a 9-level pyramid, and 9-level pyramids have, really ought to be tombs. And if I talked about the Castillo more, we would have, But I think, yeah. So there's absolutely more. Now that we've found buildings inside so many buildings, it makes you want to look inside other buildings, doesn't it? This is one of the great mysteries of a lot of my architecture, is what lies underneath. And the answer is almost always something interesting. So stay tuned for discoveries about the Castillo.